Good evening and welcome to the workshop. We will be starting. We're going to give another minute for people to hop on, and we will be starting promptly at 6 o'clock. So welcome. Okay, good evening and welcome to Danville's Housing Element 101 workshop. I would like to introduce the project team on the Zoom call this evening. My name is Diane Friedman. I am the Deputy Director of Development Services. We are also joined by Dave Crompton, who is Danville's Chief of Planning, Diana Elrod, who is the consultant working with us on the Housing Element Update project, and Kat Bravo, who will be assisting us with the presentation and the Q&A. She is our Development Services Administrative Analyst. We are so pleased to have a conversation with you about housing, as what happens on this subject at the community level is now more and more being governed by the states. Next slide, Kat. I'm getting some feedback that some mic issues. Is that, can you hear me now, Kat?
That's better, yeah.
Better? Okay. All right, thank you for that. As an overview, the intent of this workshop is to inform, and therefore we will cover three primary areas this evening. We're going to cover the background and the context to the housing element update and what is impacting the housing element update process. We are going to share probably more than you have ever wanted to know about the housing element, how you can participate in the process and the roles of the elected and appointed town officials. So we will cover the why, the what, the how, and the who. And lastly, we will be here to answer any questions that you may have. This webinar, this workshop is being recorded, and we are really dependent upon everyone to get the word out, because we want our community stakeholders, our community, to know about this process and everything that is happening that impacts it. Next slide, please. But rather than talking at you for the entirety of the session, we've structured this to be a little bit interactive. So as a warm-up activity, we'd like to see if you could help us get a better sense of our audience by taking a brief Zoom survey poll that will appear on your screen. I live in Danville, I work in Danville, I shop, dine, and/or play in Danville, all of the above. Please select the option that best describes where you live. All right, looks like we've got everybody in. Okay, so 71% of our participants live in Danville, 7% work in Danville, 64% shop, dine, and play in Danville, and 21% all of the above. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of insight into our audience this evening. Next slide, Kat. So we're going to go through the background and the context, and what we're going to do is really set the stage for our discussion with some of what's happening, the background on state housing legislation, the context to how we got to the process today and the numbers that were assigned to us. Next slide, Kat. First, let's talk about California's housing trends. And we need to start by acknowledging that for a long time now, and it continues to be, that it is very expensive to live in California. If you look at the 2015 report by the State Legislative Analyst's Office. It really illustrates the disparity that continues to grow between California's housing costs and the rest of the nation. It's grown dramatically both in home prices, and it's grown dramatically as far as the disparities for renting since the 1940s. Next slide, please. As far as other housing trends, the Legislative Analyst's Office, and the Legislative Analyst's Office is an independent office in the state legislature that does analysis on legislation and studies on housing. And, you know, they're concluding that growth in housing costs is the result of a housing supply shortage. Next slide, please. Okay. The report conclusions are reflected in a 2018 report by the Department of Housing and Community Development, commonly referred to as State HCD. In the HCD report, the number of permits issued for housing units, a leading indicator of housing construction, if you look at this graph, has never recovered from the Great Recession of 2008. Next slide, please. Why is this so? Why do we have a housing shortage? Why do we have the types of skyrocketing prices in both rents and home ownership? It is primarily because of four or five different factors. Number one is community resistance to growth. You know, there are many communities that, you know, do not want to deal with the traffic or the density of growth in their neighborhoods or in their cities. There's also the attractiveness of higher tax generating land uses. Commercial development is a much better return on investments, both for municipalities and builders. So it reaps more revenue as far as building. There's limited land to build on. You know, most of our cities are on the coast in California, and we're built out and the land is limited. There are also project delays due to the lengthy local review processes and abuse of the California Environmental Quality Act, known as CEQA, which really stops the production of new housing developments. And the cost of development is very, very high. Builders, you know, one thing that we want to make really clear is that, you know, cities do not build housing or housing developments. We zone for that. And the cost of development, the cost of building has skyrocketed due to materials, the cost of land. So it is very, very expensive to build. So if a builder or a developer is going to build, they're going to go for the highest margin rate, which is, it's not low income or very low income housing, it's market rate housing. So there becomes a greater disparity between the housing that is truly needed in California, which is for low and very low income, and market rate housing, which continues to move along at a fast pace. Next slide, Kat. If you look at prior to the pandemic, housing production was a central focus of Governor Newsom's campaign, and in his inaugural address, he included a goal of building 3.5 million housing units by 2025. This, as we know, is a stretch goal at best, because that means the entire state would need to produce over 850 units annually in the next 4 years, and that is far more that we have ever built in the state on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So due to the cost of housing and you know, all of the factors that I mentioned a little bit earlier about why we have such problems with housing disparity and housing prices, the state legislature has decided to intervene by making housing a priority in the state legislature. Over the past 4 years, over 64 bills have been passed. And these bills are really intended to expedite housing construction. This year in the legislative session that started in January of 2021, 28 bills alone have been introduced. with Senate Bill 9 receiving the most press attention given its intent to eliminate single-family zoning. Senate Bill 9, the state legislature and the Department of Housing and Community Development estimate that 65% of all the zoning in California is locked up in single-family zoning. And the intent of Senate Bill 9 is that any residential lot, if this bill passes, and it is making its way through the state assembly right now, this bill will allow a second unit on any single family lot in the state of California. It will also allow a lot split of a single family unit and the addition of a second unit on what was formerly the existing lot and 2 additional units on the subdivided lot, which means that where one single family house is right now, SB 9 would allow a lot split and additional three units on one single family lot. The objective of this is to create housing. It is called gentle density or missing middle housing. And that's 65% of single family zoning is really being focused on to create density, infill density. And if there is one takeaway from part 1 of this workshop, it's that state laws now, not local laws, have now increasingly are governing how cities must review, approve, and plan for housing. Next slide, please. And now, you know, with the social political context that we have just described to you, we're going to transition to the presentation. Diana's going to dive into the nuts and bolts of the housing element and what it means to Danville. Next slide.
Thank you, Diane. Appreciate that. Well, why do we need a housing element? And the short answer is really to comply with state law, which was enacted originally in 1969. It's a requirement for each city and county to accommodate its fair share of projected housing needs. And the law does acknowledge, as Diane had said earlier, that cities don't build housing. Instead, the law requires each jurisdiction to accommodate the units that it's projected for by planning for growth and removing constraints to development. Next slide, please. Diane alluded to this. These are recently adopted bills, and this isn't all of them either, that have an impact on how we do the housing element. And they deal with a variety of things from streamlining development standards to providing requiring greater compliance with housing element law and new requirements, including, like, for example, affirmatively furthering fair housing. So a lot of these things didn't exist a number of years ago, certainly not when we did the last housing elements, but now we are faced with these laws that impact the work we do. Next slide, please. So what is the housing element? It is a plan that demonstrates to the state, because they have to approve it, how we would accommodate the housing that is needed in our community. The housing element is the only element of the general plan that must be certified by the state, that is approved by the state. And the key here is that state and regional agencies, not the town, determines what the need is. And the plan also has to be updated every 8 years, and the period we're working on developing is 2022 to 2030. Next slide, please. What's in it? The housing plan with goals, policies, programs, and quantified objectives, an analysis of the needs in the community, an evaluation of constraints, and the identification of site to meet the needs. This is perhaps the most controversial aspect of housing element law. However, by identifying a potential opportunity site, it's always important to know the city is not making anybody do anything. It is just identifying a site that says this could be a place where housing could go. And it's always up to the owner to determine what he or she wants to do with that property. Okay, next slide is an activity. And we've talked a bit about housing, about projected housing needs. And which group do you think is the best, that is in charge of developing these housing projections? In 30 seconds, we'll have our answers. You get your choices here. We forgot the Jeopardy theme song.
You have to hum it.
No. Kat, how are we doing? Excellent. So we have a combination of federal government, state government, regional government, city councils, and other. Well, actually, it's kind of a trick question. It's two things. It's the state government and the regional government. Next slide. So the foundation of the housing element is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, or also known as RHNA, that's how it's pronounced, which involves 3 levels of government. At the state, the role of the state is to provide housing projections every 8 years for every jurisdiction in the state of California. These targets are then assigned to regions within California, including the Bay Area. And the state assigned San Francisco Bay Area number of units over the 8-year period is 441,000 plus units, which is more than 2.5 times at what it was the last cycle. At the regional level, the role of the regional planning agency is to allocate that assignment to each city and county. And then the cities and counties at the very end of the process, they play a role in that process to identify sites. It's to find the land where the housing can be accommodated and to provide goals and policies to support that. Next slide, please. So what does it mean for Danville? Well, right now it means we have to find land parcels for a minimum of 2,241 units. And these are distributed according to 4 income categories, from extremely low income to above moderate income, or market rate, essentially. And that, as I mentioned before, that begins in 2022 and ends in 2030. Now this is the minimum amount of assignment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. It's important to realize that the assignment, it's not all single family homes. The homes have to be affordable in these 4 separate income categories of very low, moderate, and above moderate. And the median is just a reference point. As you can see here, a household of 4 earning $65,000 a year, that may be one parent who works and one who's a stay-at-home parent plus 2 children. If they earn $65,000 a year, they're considered very low income in this community. Each income category is benchmarked to a percentage of the county's area median income, and the area median income for the county as a whole for a family of 4 is $119,200. At one of the income spectrum, a very low income family earns 50% of the AMI, which in this case, as I mentioned, was $65,000 per year. At the other end is above moderate, and those households earn at least $143,000 a year. And the income categories matter because higher density zoned land is necessary to address the lower income units. You can't build affordable housing that are all single family houses. It's too expensive, so there has to be multifamily housing. And for example, the units affordable to the lowest income categories have to be built at least 30 units to the acre in order to comply with state law. And this is a number known as the default density. Next slide, please. This is a lot of information to digest, and you are not expected to memorize it, but this is a list of all the jurisdictions in Contra Costa County and what their draft assignments or allocations are. You can see that Danville at 2,241 is somewhat lower than the big ones, which include unincorporated Contra Costa County, which got a very large number, Walnut Creek, and Concord. And then there are much smaller jurisdictions, including Clayton, Hercules, etc., that have even much lower numbers. But they're substantially, for every jurisdiction in the Bay Area, including in Contra Costa, they're substantially higher than what they were in the last housing element cycle. Next slide, please. And you may ask, Who gave us the assignment? And in reference to an earlier slide, it's this San Francisco Bay Area's regional government called the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG. You may have heard of that before. And one of ABAG's responsibility was to develop a method of distributing those 441,000 units assigned to the region to its 101 cities and 9 counties. It's a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. So yet another activity. What main factor did ABAG use in its methodology to allocate the area's 441,000 unit assignment to its cities? Take a wild guess. How are we doing, Kat? We have 0 for a city with high socioeconomic resources, access to jobs, 44%, access to transit, and cities with enough natural resources to support growth. Well, this one is a bit of a trick question too. It's actually a combination of 2 different factors. Next slide, please. The methodology that ABAG used, and I'm not going to try to explain this graphic, which came from ABAG. We don't claim it as our own, but essentially it said that on the left-hand side, you'll look at very low and low in the orange and lighter orange boxes. These were the number of units in these income categories that ABAG had to distribute. And essentially, for very low and low, there were 3 factors that were involved in this. One was actually access to high opportunity areas, high socioeconomic opportunity areas. The second was job proximity by auto. Can you get to a job from this location within 30 minutes? And the final factor was 15% for job proximity of transit. Can a person get to their job within 45 minutes of transit ride? So those were the focus was on high opportunity areas and job proximity via either car or transit. But for the moderate and above moderate income category, the allocation was less so on access to high opportunity areas and actually a greater percentage of job proximity via auto, because the presumption is that people who are of higher incomes generally do not take public transit. Next slide, please. And with this, am I doing this or is Dave doing this?
I think you're going to go ahead and handle this, and then it'll be my turn.
I was out of the room at the time. So what are the consequences of non-compliance? You know, people always say, well, we just won't play this game, right? And the sad fact is that by not complying with state law, a number of things happen that are very onerous to a community, including, many jurisdictions who don't have a housing element that's in compliance can't get certain kinds of state and maybe federal pass-through funding for various projects that a community might want to do. Probably the most well-known is transportation money, is that if you don't have a housing element that's in compliance, you can't get certain kinds of funding. The second is court-imposed fines up to $600,000 per month if you're not in compliance. And I think the last aspect is probably what troubles people the most, is the legal risk and loss of local control. We may, arguably feel like the state is making it difficult for us and not letting us have our own control. But the truth is if we don't comply with these rules, we'll have even less control. And that includes court-mandated compliance, court approval of housing developments, and potential suspension of local building authority. And we don't really want to have that happen. To the extent that we can comply, that's what we're here to do. Next slide. David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diana, and good evening, everybody. So I wanted to kind of step back and do a little bit of a deeper dive into our RHNA numbers and talk a little bit about the significant challenges that we have in meeting the RHNA numbers that have been assigned to us. And it's similar to other cities that might have the same characteristics as Danville. And especially when it comes to the low and very low income units that we've been assigned. And I'm going to use the recently completed and occupied Elexon Riverwalk project, which is downtown. It's on Diablo Road right there by the southbound on-ramp. And that was a project that was actually one of the sites that we rezoned and redesignated as part of our last housing element. And that was it's about 3.5 acres. And it was redesignated from an office site to multifamily with up to 30 units per acre. And so the developer came in and they built a 144 unit apartment project. And what they also did was invoke what's known as state density bonus law. And that's a law that allows for higher densities or a density bonus in exchange for certain affordability components. And so they actually built the 144 units and it came out to almost 40 units an acre, but they're only required to deed restrict 10 of the 144 units as very low income units. So that means 134 of the units are actually renting at market rate, which is between almost $2,600 and almost $5,000 a month. And so we have 10 very low income units and the rest are at moderate or above moderate rates for that project. And the real problem that causes is that there's also a law, one of the laws that Diana listed earlier, called the no net loss law. That basically means that if this was a site that previously the town designated as 30 units an acre that was going to fulfill our low and very low housing numbers, and we actually ended up with only 10 units that are low and very low, we have to immediately make that up somewhere else. So it kind of rolls over, and if we didn't do it here like we said we were going to do it, then we have to find another site for it. And so you can kind of see that we're already 134 units in the hole as we're looking at our next housing element to make up what we didn't do, what we thought we were going to do in our last housing element cycle. And also looking at the the sites that we're going to have to find as this next housing element and designate at 30 units an acre. Again, we're going to be running into this same problem because communities like Danville start out with very, very high land costs. And so if you build a project and you're a developer and you're in it for a profit and you're only required to deed restrict a certain number to be low or very low, the rest are going to be market rate. And in Danville, they're not going to qualify for low or very low income rates. Next slide, please. So participation. So hopefully we've piqued your interest in participating in the process, because despite what we have to do, how we do it's going to be essential in preserving the core planning values that I think a lot of us have worked really hard to preserve in Danville over the last 30 plus years since incorporation. Next slide, please. So the process that we're going to be going through, that we are going through, is first of all, we recognize that it's going to be very, very important to reach out to our community to get feedback and education, so everybody knows what we're tasked with and what our constraints are coming from the state. So we want to make sure everybody understands that. And we also want participation. We want to get some feedback on, if we're going to go forward with this, what would be our priorities? How are we going to do this? Where should we do it? Where should we look for higher density housing, et cetera? And so we've started this process of public outreach. We're doing these Housing 101 webinars. We've reached out directly and had webinars with some of our local groups, like the realtors groups and Rotary groups. We have the veterans groups and others coming up. So we're going to be doing this all summer and into the fall and winter. And we've also set up a very good website that has a lot of information, a lot of links to the state laws that we're going to keep updated with where we are in the process. Diane's going to talk a little bit more in depth about that in a moment. So going forward, how do we get this across the finish line? So by spring or summer of next year, we're going to have to be starting to identify the sites that we would redesignate for housing to meet our RHNA numbers. And as part of that, we'll have to prepare an environmental impact report to evaluate whatever potential impacts might be associated with that. Think of traffic and air quality and noise and biological concerns. So all that will be looked at. We have to submit a draft housing element to the state of California for review for 60 days before we adopt it. And then the process, next slide, please. So the process that we'll be going through is through our public hearings. After we've got as much input from the community as we can, we'll prepare the draft housing element and propose general plan and rezoning sites for it. And the route it would take to adoption would be first through our planning commission. And the planning commission is a panel or a commission that is appointed by the town council. They're volunteer residents of the town of Danville. So they will review the draft housing element, the general plan changes, rezonings, the environmental impact report, hold public hearings on that, and ultimately make a recommendation to the town council. Town council would be the final stop. They will review all those parts of this project and they would make a final decision on it. The housing element needs to be submitted to the state of California by January of 2023. And hopefully at that point, the state will once again review it and determine whether or not we're in compliance with state laws. So that hopefully would be the end of the process for us until we get into the real meat of it. As far as the next steps with developers or property owners coming forward and wanting to, possibly develop the properties. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it back over to Diane. She's going to talk a little bit more about the website we put together and some of the interactive tools and information that we have there.
Great, thanks, Dave. We've recently launched an online engagement portal, www.danvilletowntalks.org. This portal will serve as a source of facts about laws and processes as we continue to move through this housing element update process. The reason that we sent this portal up is it allows two-way communication with our community. You can talk directly to staff members who are involved in this process, and we can answer you directly. It is the only vehicle that we have out there right now that is direct. We're starting to see information come out on Nextdoor. It is really, really important that we coalesce all this information, all these comments on this portal for a number of reasons. We want to have two-way communication with you. We want to get your feedback on the housing element update and all the questions we want answered that you have about this process, state mandates, housing legislation that is coming up. We need your input on where to zone for the 2,241 plus units that we are mandated to zone for. We will share our state advocacy efforts with stakeholders. We are extremely involved in impacting the legislation that is continuing to really impact your town council's ability to make local decisions on zoning and building. We want feedback and comments and ideas shared on this portal that will be used to help us make decisions. So we're asking you to sign up for the portal. We are reaching out to you in other ways. This week, some of you may have already received our newsletter for the summer. The center spread talks all about this process and Senate Bill 9. There are other housing bills that are out there that are designed to impact local control. The state is seeking ways to solve the housing crisis process by production. And they believe that by production, more houses means we're going to lower the overall cost of housing in California. And that's the objective. Next slide, please. So ways that you can participate, you can subscribe on the portal to our news feed. We are going to be sending out updates to this process using this portal, and you can sign up and we will be sending you updates via email. You can learn about housing and its governing legislation to provide informed input. I'll speak a little bit about that in a few minutes. You can, let your neighbors know, let your community groups know, ask questions. We have a Q&A that is available for you. We will stay here as long as it takes to answer all of your questions. Participate in surveys. We have surveys included in the online portal. There is also a survey that is included in the newsletter that is hitting this week. You can contribute ideas to where you think the housing needs to be zoned. Also, you can share your housing story about how long you've lived in Danville. You know, there are a lot of people that cannot afford to live here, our children, students, you know, and we want to hear your Danville story, and we want everybody to really see and use this portal. It will help lead the way here, and we need everybody's input on this. Next slide, please. You can, using the portal, you can text your ideas directly onto the idea wall. So, you know, if you have an idea right now as you're listening to us, please take advantage of this text number and text an idea onto our idea wall. You can navigate to the idea wall. We have also launched a forum where you can talk to each other using that forum on the towntalks.org portal. And next slide, please. We have more housing workshops. The next housing workshop will be August 19th. In the meantime, we're also, Dave talked about this a few minutes ago, using meetings, what we call pop-up meetings, to go out to community members, HOAs. We have a meeting coming up with the Chamber of Commerce. We are reaching out to any community organizations to try and spread the word about this really important process for our community members to become engaged and participate. Our next August session is the 19th. Thanks, Kat. And then the 31st and September 18th. Next slide. And then let's talk a little bit about legislation, because, you know, legislation is impacting this process. It is a state issue. You know, there are two elected officials, Senator Glazer, that's his contact information, Assembly Member Rebecca Bauer-Cahan, that is her contact information. The town is very actively involved in advocacy on behalf of Danville. We are a member of the Tri-Valley Cities Coalition of the cities of Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin, and San Ramon. We work with a lobbyist based in Sacramento, Townsend Public Affairs, and we as a region are 365,000 voices strong, which brings us up to a top 10 voice in the state of California. So we are leveraging a coalition to speak about these issues that are impacting housing and local control on behalf of Danville. And we are making suggestions to amend the language to blunt some of the forces or the impacts on local control. We also have, you know, our town council has directed us to start a legislative committee, which we did because they had the foresight to see what was coming. We have legislative committee meetings on the 4th Tuesday of every month at 9 a.m. All of our agendas are published online. You can look at the advocacy work that we're doing, the letters that we're writing. You can read the reports, and you can really, really walk through the journey with us on how we are actively involved in this legislation. And we also work with Washington, D.C. So we think it's really important. We also provide town council updates on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. I provide a legislative update. So if you're interested in finding out historically what we've been doing from the beginning of the legislative session, you can go to our website, you can look up our agendas, you can look at our recordings for the town council meetings, and you can look at the reports and really get an idea of how we advocate on behalf of our community. Next slide, please. So with that said, you know, I don't think we have any Q&As. There was one question: how can I get a copy of the recording? Each recording that we have, I think it was June the end of June, we published the recording. It is on our website. It's on the danvilletowntalks.org website, YouTube. So this recording will be published out on our websites for you to share with other community members. And again, we are really encouraging everyone to spread the word. You know, as we go, we want to see more and more participation. And we don't want, you know, we want your ideas and thoughts, and we certainly don't want any surprises as far as the legislation. You know, whatever you're feeling on this, if you are involved or interested in this, please, you know, pick up the phone and share your thoughts with your local state legislators. All right, we see some questions coming in, Kat?
Yes, we have two. So the first question is, how do ADUs fit into this plan?
I can answer that one. So ADUs do fit into the plan, and the town has long encouraged ADUs because they seem to be a good way to fit housing into neighborhoods, which, you know, doesn't really impact the character of neighborhoods. And so going forward, well, I don't know if we have a exact size yet that the state is going to say is considered to be affordable, but generally ADUs below a certain size are considered to be moderate income units. And so, you know, if we get 30 ADUs, that could be equal to 1 acre of housing, you know, at 30 units an acre for moderate income. I think that, you know, as we go forward, we'll have to show the state, based on probably some type of a nexus study, what is affordable in Danville as far as the rental and what sizes are you know, are considered to be affordable. You may know that the town, you know, in trying to use ADUs to offset our RENA numbers, we've created what we call a garden cottage program, where we hired 2 architects to develop 3 different floor plans at different sizes, I think around 600 and around 800 and around 1,000 square feet. So we have plans that are pre-designed, pre-engineered, 3 different, each of the floor plans has 3 different elevation, you know, types: Spanish, Mediterranean, craftsman style. And those are on our website. They're online for anybody to download for free. And you can come in and get a building permit and build them. So ADUs are a way of offsetting the RENA numbers, and we'd like to see more of them in Danville.
The next question we have is, what are projections to our home values as capacity grows at this rate?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if Diana, you know, if you have experienced this in other areas. I don't think that the state or the regional governments have taken into consideration what impacts there might be on property values. Diana, do you have any insight?
I do not. I do know that, you know, considering the amount of units that we actually need to develop, not just in Danville but statewide, is so great. As Diane was mentioning, that I doubt that we're going to get to so much supply that will actually result in a reduction of either values or prices for housing at this point, primarily because land is very expensive. The cost of construction is outrageously expensive. In the Bay Area right now, there are projects, of regular housing projects, multifamily housing projects that just the cost to develop them per, and not including profit or anything, is about $600,000 to $700,000 per unit. So the prices are always going to be high. The labor unions have a lot involved in that as well, and just the desirability of living in California. So I don't think that the projections, if the numbers do anything, they'll probably continue to go up, at least as far as I can tell.
And, you know, part of that in our, you know, the state legislatures, you know, drive to produce production, to them, they really think that's going to equate to lowering prices. But as Diana mentioned, you know, if you look at an SB 9 or an SB 10, which is going to allow by right development of up to 10 units on a single family lot with town council approval, really, there is not an affordability component in there. You're not going to get low or extremely low housing in there. And what it's going to wind up doing is kind of exacerbating the problem and speculating. This is going to be a great deal for speculators who may be looking at a distressed property on a large lot in Danville and can turn around, subdivide a single family lot and create 3 additional market rate units. It has nothing to do with affordability, will not solve the housing crisis problem, but it will change eventually. It will change neighborhoods. So, and we are, as I mentioned, we are constantly talking to Sacramento and our elected officials about, this is not bringing us affordability. The other thing that has not happened historically is for the low and extremely low income housing projects, there's not state funding, and they're very high risk projects for developers. They're very high, they're hard to get financing for. They say they cost the same amount to build as a market rate unit. So there's not incentive for builders to build the housing that is needed in California. The state just received $25 billion in ARPA funds and did dedicate money to the Department of Housing and Community Development, but that is only going to be enough to fund 6,300 affordable units. So as Diana mentioned, we're trying to solve this problem through legislation. The biggest help we can get is financial help from the state to build low and extremely low housing.
All right, and we don't have any other questions.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, last slide, Kat. We would like to thank you for participating in this workshop today. As we mentioned, we have other workshops. Please go to our portal, sign up for our portal, ask your friends, your neighbors, your community groups to to really get the word out. We're going to continue to do outreach on this. We want you involved in this process. We really appreciate your time. And if you have any thoughts or feedback, please let us know. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.